Now that we've learned the rook, I think it's time we double your knowledge, don't you? Let's learn our second piece, which is the bishop. And a lot of kids think the bishop has his mouth open because he's ready to eat some pieces. But before we can do some eating, we have to set the table first by teaching you how the bishop moves. Quite simply, the bishop moves along the diagonals of the chessboard. And I see two really long diagonals that the bishop is occupying. Notice every square of a diagonal is the same color. In this case, the white squares. If the bishop begins the game on the white squares, he must stay on the white squares, kind of like the shoes on your feet. Whatever color they are today, they're going to be the same color tomorrow unless you step in some mud. Let's move the bishop along, and the bishop can move one square if it wants to, or much like the rook, it has the decision. It can go further, it can go 2 squares, or all the way to the side of the board. Of course, you can't go off the side of the board. That wouldn't be possible. The bishop can also choose these 4 squares, and the bishop can go backward as long as he moves along the diagonals. We've got 3 more squares, and if you were to count really quickly the number of arrows that Fun Master Mike drew, you'd get to 13. Recall the rook was able to go to 14 different squares, but the bishop is less powerful than the rook for a different reason. The bishop can only ever touch one color of the board. The rook can touch both, so most of the time we think the rook is a little more powerful than the bishop. Let's get to moving the bishop. Let's move the bishop 2 squares. Okay, now move the bishop 1 square. Now we'll go all the way down the board. We'll stop on this square. Then we can go to the square D1, and we can keep on moving. I think it's time to learn how the bishop does some eating. I've magically added a couple of black rooks to the chessboard. Which one can the bishop run into on the next turn? Well, that's actually a pretty easy question with bishops. Because the bishop's on a white square, only one of these rooks is on a white square. So, unless I'm lying to you, it's got to be that rook. And in order for the bishop to capture, all it does is move diagonal, staying very carefully on those white squares. You land on top of the black piece, and you take it off the board. Just like with the rook, when you make a capture, you have to stop. You can't keep going. That makes it impossible to capture more than one piece at a time. Now, if we wanted to capture this other black rook, well, actually, it would be impossible even if I gave that bishop an unlimited number of moves. The bishop could go 1 square and then down 2 squares, and the bishop could dance all around the rook. But as long as that rook stays still, the rook might as well be invisible. The bishop cannot see the rook. In fact, if you recall back to our lesson on the rooks, the minute black gets a move, the black rook will just come over and capture the bishop. I think the next thing we should do is play a little rook versus bishop game. I'm going to call it Tom versus Jerry. Tom versus Jerry is a story of a cat chasing a mouse. Does the cat ever get the mouse? Well, I'll let you watch the cartoon and decide. But in our game, we're going to have the rook be the cat, the bishop's going to be the mouse, and as we all know, cats like to chase mice. So let's have this black rook come all the way down to the square A1, and as you can see, the rook is about to capture the bishop. Now it's time for Jerry to run away. But you know what? Sometimes you do not want to go as far as is possible. For example, could the bishop travel all the way to A6? Yeah, it could, but if it did, the rook would just back up because rooks go in straight lines and would capture the bishop. So what I would advise you to do in this position is move the bishop to a different square. Sometimes a shorter number of moves is actually better. So we're going to move the bishop just 2 squares. And again, let's have Tom chase Jerry. The bishop's in danger, but we're going to move diagonal. And let's go to the square G6. Okay, the rook can now attack the bishop again. Let's have the rook go sideways to G1. The bishop's in danger. Bishop runs away again. And you know what? Doesn't really happen in the cartoon. But let's just say the cat is having a bad day and travels up the board but stops on G6. What is Jerry going to do? Yeah, Jerry can actually catch Tom by going diagonal, landing on top of the rook. And remember, when you make a capture, you have to stop. 2 more quick notes about the bishop, then it'll be time for you kids to start solving. I've added a few more pieces to the board to show you that when you start a chess game, you're actually going to get 2 bishops, one on the light squares, one on the dark squares. And your bishops can never run into each other because they're always going to operate only on their own color. That'd be like having a left shoe of one color and a right of another color. And while that might be a bad fashion statement, it would resemble a chess game. And the last thing to talk about, chess kids, is what happens when you run into your own piece. For example, if this bishop on G6 wants to capture the rook, unfortunately your own rook's in the way. In chess, you can't jump over your own rook, even though it kind of looks like I just did it. You have to stop and land on the square right before you get to it. So this bishop could only move to the square F5. That's it. A better option would be to move your rook out of the way and that opens the diagonal if black doesn't see what's coming. Then you can capture the black rook on the next turn, and truly the bishop will have eaten another piece. I think we've had a full meal, and now it's time for you to get solving.